Welcome back, Dr. Milo Wolf here, PhD in sports science, reacting to EUGENE TEO. To be perfectly transparent, I haven't watched any of his videos before. So, in the spirit of actual hashtag science, this is about as unbiased as it can get. I'm going to be reacting to his advice from the point of view of a sports scientist. That is to say, my standard for evidence, or what makes for good, solid advice, that we can give to people confidently might be different from a practitioner's, let's say. But I'll also try to see things from a lifter's perspective, as I am in fact a lifter. Without further ado, let's get into the video.
Here's 10 things I wish I knew earlier about training legs. These tips wouldn't have just helped me build muscle and get stronger, but do it in less time, more effectively, whilst improving my ability and overall athleticism. And they would have really helped me fall in love with the process a lot sooner, as opposed to feeling like I was just forcing myself to do the work because I had to, and not because it was something that I truly enjoyed. So first up is to lean back on the leg extension. This is one of those things where science is starting to catch up to the bro science from decades ago. Leg extensions are one of the few ways for us to train one of the muscles of the thigh called the rectus femoris. Laying back, as opposed to sitting upright, places it into a slightly more stretched out or longer position, which, based on a few nerdy muscle physiology principles like stretch medial hypertrophy and the length-tension relationship, seems to be a slightly stronger and more effective position to be training a muscle from. So give it a shot. I usually find that most people end up being around 20 to 30% stronger on this once they get used to it, which means you can expose your body to more tension and stimulate more gains. You don't have to lay all the way back till you're completely horizontal. The goal is to open up your hip angle to find your own comfortable position. So you still want your butt to be in contact with the seat so you don't lose stability.
So I think the first tip is actually pretty solid. This aligns perfectly with the muscle length research that I've been involved in. I think there's a few things to consider here though. You might know that I recently released a short that is entitled, "Is the leg extension the worst quad builder?" And I kind of stand by that. Because the discussion of what is a good and bad exercise fundamentally hinges on what alternatives are there, and exercise is only good or bad in relation to other options available. And by quad exercise, by the way, I mean commonly performed quad exercises, notwithstanding technique, because technique can be bad or good on any exercise. Equally, you have to keep in mind that when we're discussing exercises, we're discussing them on average. There's always going to be context to consider. So for you, the leg extension might not be the worst exercise, but my point is that it might be the worst exercise on average for the average trainee when it comes to the alternatives present. I think if you have a lovely leg extension, like the one shown in this video right here, which allows you to lean back a bunch, get your hips a lot more extended, thereby lengthening the rectus femoris to a greater extent, the leg extension might no longer be the worst quad exercise. Absolutely, I agree with Eugene here that if you have a leg extension and you want to make it more effective and you're set on using the leg extension in your training, leaning back is going to be a great tool. But personally, I still think the reverse Nordic curl, which allows you to fully extend your hips and fully flex your knees, and the same thing with the sissy squat, are going to be slightly better in terms of getting you a full stretch on your rectus femoris and being most challenging in that position. Because ultimately, most leg extensions do still suffer from the limitation that there is very little tension at the bottom in the stretch position compared to the top. But by and large, I agree with Eugene here.
The second tip is to use a variety of load carrying options for single leg exercises like lunges, split squats, and step-ups. People think single leg exercises are designed for two things: ironing out side-to-side imbalances and to improve total overall balance. Now, strength discrepancies between sides may improve some, but will always have a strong side and a weak side. As for balance, that is more a side effect of the exercise and not necessarily the goal. If you really want to work on your balance, you'd be doing balancing drills like standing on one leg. The real reason why we do single leg movements is to access different amounts of rotation occurring at the hips. When I hold the weight on the non-working side only, or what's called contralateral loading, this pulls my body and pelvis towards the working leg, which increases the challenge on hip mobility over time. Ipsilateral loading is holding the weight on the working side only and has the opposite rotational force, which makes it slightly easier to push out from the bottom position. And if you hold the weight on both sides, you don't get any of that, but you do get nice stability that can help you overload the muscle. Neither is better or worse. I'd simply be looking at asking yourself, what have you been neglecting, and does it show up in things like poor hip mobility or the ability to rotate your legs?
By and large, I agree with Eugene here. I don't think worrying about your hip mobility is something most people need to do. Unless you have terrible mobility, increasing your mobility isn't inherently going to increase your health or what have you. And I think the bigger reason to use unilateral exercises is actually completely different. And that is to reduce the load on your spine. By training one leg at a time, you're effectively roughly halving the weight that your core needs to stabilize, that your lower back needs to work to extend your spine against. Meanwhile, your leg is still getting a great stimulus. And so if you have some back pain, or if you tend to be bottlenecked by how much your lower back can recover from, then maybe using single leg exercises can be a great way to get more effective volume in for your legs without necessarily loading your spine or your core in general that much.
Third thing is to lean forwards while doing seated leg curls. I love seated leg curls. They're probably the most bang for your buck direct hamstring exercise for building end range strength and muscle without putting any load through your spine and creating extra fatigue like you would through a typical hinge variation like good mornings or Romanian deadlifts. They also give you a lot of stability, so all you have to focus on is pushing as hard as you can without worrying about much else. Here's something that seems obvious, but most people don't realize right away. When you're at the start of a seated leg curl, you're in the exact same position as the bottom of a Romanian deadlift. So what does this mean? It means just like the RDL, we're in a really good position here to be stretching the hamstring and getting it loaded up in that position. So when I cue an RDL, I normally think about making my chest as proud as possible to tip my pelvis forwards to increase the stretch on the back of my legs. And the same thing can be done on the seated leg curl to get that extra stretch as well. Check out how pro natural bodybuilder and black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, Jimmy House, sets up this exercise.
So here from this position, I'm gonna be leaning forward as if I was trying to touch my toes. Pull your chest up and straighten out your entire spine here. Flex the quad, squeeze through that, hold, control on the way back, load the eccentric, flex the quad again, you should feel that stretch, and squeeze. And that's one of the best ways you can use a simple machine that you can find at any commercial gym to help mobilize your hamstring.
I agree with Eugene here, and in fact I have a whole video on the best hamstring exercises up here somewhere, where I think the seated leg curl is the single best leg curl variation for hamstring growth. And I also agree that leaning forward is going to further lengthen 3 heads of the hamstrings, the ones that insert at the hip. That's to say every head but the biceps femoris is short head, and therefore likely lead to more hypertrophy. Indeed, we had a study by Milo and colleagues directly comparing the seated leg curl to the lying leg curl, showing better hypertrophy of the hamstrings, again, the ones that do insert at the hip, with the seated leg curl compared to the lying leg curl, or essentially greater hypertrophy in hamstrings when you're lengthening the hamstrings to a greater extent. And so leaning forward is just another way to further increase the stretch.
Next up, we have using straps for front squats. The load placement on front squats allows you to more easily get into a full depth squat. So even if you have horrible mobility and proportions, most people will find it easier to get into a front squat than a back squat. The only issue is it's limited by how effectively you can hold the weight up in front of your body. If you don't have the mobility for a clean grip, most people opt for the cross-arm variation, which is perfectly valid, but it's also quite challenging when you get tired. Another option is to use straps to work around your wrist and shoulder mobility. You simply attach them to the bar where your hands would normally go, pull them tight, and use them to keep the bar fixed in place. You're able to focus on the same cues as you would with the clean grip to tension your lats and upper back without worrying about the bar rolling forwards down your arms. Another great option for anterior load and helps you stay more upright while squatting is the Zercher carry position, although that definitely takes a lot of getting used to.
I agree with pretty much all of that. I don't really have much to say, except that the Zercher squat, in my experience, does limit depth to an extent. I rarely see, because of the way the bar is being held and the elbows getting in the way of the legs and what have you. From what I've seen, most people don't manage to get quite as deep in a Zercher squat compared to a front squat.
Tip number 5 is training calves first. I think many people get stuck into the same pattern of training the big compound lifts first. It's always squats first. But there are also going to be a lot of benefits to training other areas like your calves or hamstrings first. First and foremost is from a basic priority standpoint. Whatever you do first, you're able to give the most attention and mental energy towards, which is why you'd pick the hardest compound exercises to go first usually. But that often leaves the same exercises and body parts to be tacked on to the end of a workout, and they wind up becoming more and more neglected and weaker long term. Calves and hamstrings are the biggest 2 ones that get overlooked here. John Meadows was a big fan of doing leg curls before squats as a way to warm up the hips, and I think that's really great. I like to extend it down to the calves as well. No matter how hard you go, you're not going to completely wipe yourself out to the point of decreasing performance on the big stuff like your squats and deadlifts. But if anything, you're probably going to improve your mobility and stability, and you're going to finally start training an area that has been neglected for so long.
Yep, I completely agree with this, and I have a whole video on exercise order here, which kind of broadly aligns with this idea of potentially doing your leg curls and your calves first. Neither of them are going to impact your performance on squats, but the other way around, squats do tend to impact your performance on leg curls and calves just by being more systemically fatigued. And additionally, doing calf raises before any sort of squatting type work, whether squats, leg press, hack squats, can actually be a great dynamic warm-up wherein you become more flexible in your ankles thereafter and are able to get deeper into your squat. So not only does training calves first potentially lead to better performance across the session, but it also potentially allows you to get a little bit deeper in your squat. And by getting deeper, you're training at lower muscle lengths, which, to bring it all back to the thing that people always complain about me talking about too much, is probably good for muscle growth. I am sorry for talking about my PhD's topic and trying to communicate science to you. I apologize.
Number 6 is, while we're talking about mobility and specifically the ankles, elevating your heels when you squat is not cheating. People often say it's a band-aid or crutch for poor mobility and is just masking a problem without addressing it. Well, for many people, this problem isn't poor mobility, it's literally their bone structure, where you can have two people of similar heights but incredibly different relative leg lengths and torso lengths. All else being equal, people with longer torsos and shorter femurs will have a more upright squat and easier time getting into a deep knee bend squat than people with shorter torsos and longer femurs. Elevating the heels in this case would be giving those longer femored people a relatively shorter femur, which helps to balance things out a little bit more. Now, if that's cheating, then I, as someone who has genetically good leg and torso lengths for squatting, I'm permanently playing the game in God mode. Elevating your heels on a wedge or using squat shoes or even just a couple of small plates can make your squats feel so much better, which means you can train even harder and get more out of your leg days, which sounds pretty good to me.
Yep, I agree. And even the people who are all about functional fitness, that is to say getting functionally better in your everyday life through lifting, I don't think there's much of a case here for saying that, oh, if you're elevating your heels, that is somehow worse. It turns out in everyday life, you're not really ending up in an ass to grass position all that often anyways to begin with. And therefore, it doesn't really matter if you use, for example, weightlifting shoes in your training or if you use heel elevated squats. And ultimately, if you want a bit of a rabbit hole, the benefits of lifting weights and of cardio actually max out pretty early. You don't need to do a ton of cardio or lift in a specific way to get the vast majority of the health benefits. And it really doesn't take much. So to think that it is vastly less functional for your overall health to use weightlifting shoes or to use a heel elevation when you squat, I just don't think there's anything we have to claim that with confidence. And yes, my evidentiary standard for what we can actually claim with confidence might be very different from yours. Personally, unless there's relatively compelling evidence in favor of a claim being true, I won't make that claim with much confidence, if any. I might just rely on saying, hey, look, as a coach, I've noticed this. That isn't a very strong claim, and I make it clear. But if someone's making a very strong claim, very confident claim, based on no evidence, look, they may be right, but there's a very solid chance that they were wrong. And certainly, the way that they've arrived at that conclusion does create some issues.
This next one isn't one that I do a lot anymore, but it definitely serves a purpose. It can be an absolute game changer for a lot of people. So have you ever lifted up a weight that you've done before, so you know you can do it, but on this specific day it just felt really heavy, and your performance sucked because of it? If so, this tip is for you. Doing explosive jumps at the start of your workout, and even immediately before your work sets on exercises like squats or deadlifts, may improve your overall performance. This trick relies on a theory known as post-activation potentiation, or in simple terms, the activation of all the muscles in a max effort jump carries over to your max lift and improves the activation there. We often think of muscle activation happening like an on-off switch. You either turn on your muscles and lift the weights, or you don't. And that's kind of true, but not the complete picture. Muscle activation happens a little bit more like a dimmer switch. We've got these really big, strong, powerful muscle fibers that won't get activated until we absolutely need them. It takes a lot of energy and effort to use them, so your body prefers to turn that dimmer switch only maybe a quarter or half the way up and activate only the smaller, weaker muscle fibers if it can get away with it. Now that's fine, but if we flash back to you going to pick up a weight that you know you can do, but it feels a lot heavier than it should, that's usually because your body hasn't recruited all of his muscle fibers yet, which would probably mean it's going to be one tough set. Doing just a couple of max effort jumps is a really simple way to turn on all your muscle fibers and get them activated. That activation should then carry across to your main work sets. So we're not doing this to generate a ton of fatigue with super high reps, and if you need to, you can take maybe a short rest before you're doing your actual work set of whatever it is you're doing. But if you struggle with this sort of thing, it makes a pretty noticeable difference immediately.
By and large, I agree with Eugene here. A couple caveats though. One is that I actually read a recent, unpublished, systematic review on the topic of post-activation performance enhancement for boosting performance in the gym. Caveat number one, it is likely going to have the biggest effect about 4 to 10 minutes after you do that jump or that explosive task. Caveat number two, I think you may be getting the benefit as far as post-activation performance enhancement goes by just doing that lift in an ascending manner, gradually increasing the weight, but being as explosive as you can on those warm-ups. For example, let's say you're walking up to 500 pounds for a single on deadlifts. If a few minutes before that single, you maybe do a single warming up with 450 and you perform that as explosively as possible, there's a good chance you're getting that post-activation performance enhancement effect from that 450 single already. And adding in that jump might not actually confer you any additional advantage.
Tip number 8 is don't neglect your adductors. Your adductors are your inner thigh muscles that work to pull your legs from a wide stance into a narrow stance. They're also one of the prime hip extensor muscles that help you out of the bottom of a squat. We don't really think of doing much direct adductor work outside of the seated adduction machine, which I'm guessing for many of you is something you aren't really doing because it's a pretty fluffy accessory exercise overall. But given the size, strength, and role of the adductors, and the fact that we don't do much work that directly trains and biases them, this is a huge opportunity for us to make some pretty big wins by adding in just a small amount of work in. So doing some wider horse stance work like deadlifts and squats in these wider positions is a really simple way to start to access them a little bit more. They're also going to be working a little bit more when we have that rotational element from the earlier tip on the single leg exercises, so do that too. Adding in just a few exercises like seated adductions or Copenhagen planks and other variations are also great options.
So, I agree with Eugene here that training the adductors directly is a pretty low-hanging fruit to improve your leg size. And in fact, I have a whole video on my routine somewhere up here, and you can see that once a week, I do my hip adduction and hip abduction superset to train those muscle groups that get neglected. What Eugene didn't mention here is that the only muscle in the adductors that is actually responsible for hip extension is the adductor magnus. The other two muscles that are grouped underneath the adductor's umbrella, the adductor longus and brevis, don't actually perform hip extension. And importantly, this makes for an even better case for including some adductor training in your routine if you can and have the time to do so. Because those two admittedly smaller muscle groups otherwise don't really get trained all that well in your routine. And just adding in maybe once a week, some direct adductor work might get them to grow pretty substantially as they are functionally untrained.
Next up is all about improving your mobility and range of motion. Just about everybody has tight hips. Doing stretching can absolutely help, but a big rock that many people are skipping over is adding in a deliberate 3-second pause in the bottom of exercise that emphasize the lengthened or stretched position for their muscles. So think of things like calf raises, which emphasizes dorsiflexion and the ankle joint, or a Romanian deadlift, which emphasizes hip flexion and the hamstrings, and a weighted pigeon or seated good morning for the hip abductors and glutes, and a split squat for hip extension and quads. It doesn't have to be complicated, just try to include at least one exercise per week for each muscle group that takes the muscle to its completely stretched out position under load, and prioritize it with an extra 3-second hold in that stretched position on every rep. I love it on calf raises in particular, as many people tend to bounce out of the bottom here because of how small that range of motion is and how relatively strong their Achilles tendons tend to be in the ankle. So this will build active strength and stability in all those hard to reach places, which will make you more mobile and resilient long term.
So, I'm not sure about resilience necessarily. I think just training in general will make you pretty resilient. I don't think pauses will necessarily increase that, but I agree with this. And in fact, there's a meta-analysis comparing the range of motion improvements, or essentially your mobility, from specifically passive stretching to lifting weights. And in fact, the improvements in your mobility or flexibility or range of motion over time are similar. And while it doesn't need to be a 3-second pause, it could be a 1-second pause, it could be just spending more time in that lengthened position by increasing the stretch in your exercises, doing lengthened partials, for example. Always bringing it back to lengthened partials, baby. All of that may get you slightly more flexible over time, just by virtue of lifting weights, and potentially even more flexible than just training through a full range of motion with no constraints on the range of motion or no constraints on the tempo.
Last tip, and probably the most important that I still see so many people arguing about, is that you don't have to do barbell squats when you train legs. Whether it's due to structure, mobility, or simply preference, many people don't want to do barbell squats, but feel like they have to because it's the king of exercises. Squats are an essential pattern to be training, as is lunging, but doing it as a specific movement of barbell squats is not. There are so many other free weight or machine-based options available for you to train your body to its limit. While I think most people should work on gaining proficiency in the barbell squat at some point, it's absolutely not an essential movement. Progressively overloading your body over time and being consistent is important, so do whatever allows you to do that and you'll get fantastic results. results.
And for his final tip, I do also agree with him. I'm not sure I would classify any pattern even as functionally necessary. That is to say, essential that you have it in your routine. For instance, let's say you can't squat for some reason, or you really don't want to squat. I think you'll probably get mostly the same health benefits, at least, maybe not hypertrophy, by doing some RDLs, some leg extensions, and potentially even some lunges, although that may fall under the whole squat umbrella. But overall, I do also agree with this claim as well. So that is my reaction to EUGENE TEO's 10 tips for bigger legs. Overall, I've got to say, besides some slight caveats that might stem from me being more familiar with the research or him having a bit of a different experience more practically, I think this was really solid. Like, I would give it, just considering there's 10 points here, right? And I agreed with virtually all of them, minus some minor caveats. I would give this like a solid 8 or 9 out of 10. Very good, very practical, solid. That's my reaction. If you enjoyed the video, leave a comment down below, like the video, subscribe. Let me know who else you want to see me react to. If you'd like me to take care of your training and nutrition, click the link above and I can start coaching you. In the meantime, have a fantastic day and I will see you in that next one. Peace.